Hey, good morning, everyone. In History of the United States Constitution, we're now segueing into sort of the second half of the semester, even though I don't think we're quite halfway there in terms of the calendar. But we have to spend a little bit more time, I think, on civil rights, civil liberties, and some of the amendments that have been implemented into the Constitution. I think most students find this more enjoyable section of the course, anyways. Um, we start off with obviously the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are considered the first 10 amendments, even though some of those don't contain necessarily specific individual liberties that are going to be protected by the government and or enforced by the government. Like the 10th Amendment, for example, is going to be reserving certain powers to the states. That was probably already granted by Article 1, Section 8 by only giving the federal government certain enumerated powers. But people were so frightened of this new centralized authority in the federal government that they wanted some explicit statement retaining certain what we call police powers to the states. But we start at this aspect of the First Amendment. We're just going to go through the most important, and it is the most important amendment, is the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. But we know the first 10. We haven't amended the Constitution that many times. God, I hate to say this. I hope I'm correct, or I'm going to have to start the video over again. I believe there's 27 amendments in total. Let's see. Yes, 27 amendments. So we know the first 10 came as a package. In that, why? Because when the Constitution was being brought to the different states, to the constitutional conventions held in each state to vote on it, there was a real question about whether or not this thing was going to pass. It was fairly controversial. We know the Federalists were promoting adoption, and the Anti-Federalists were advocating rejection of it, that it was going to give too much power to the central government, or it didn't contain protections for civil liberties, those unalienable rights that should never be taken away or interfered with by government unless under extraordinary circumstances. And so the big selling point was, we promise, and I don't know, maybe not today, but back in that era, when these aristocratic leaders of our nation that were democratically elected went around saying, we will, when the first Congress meets, we will propose a set of Bill of Rights that you guys are concerned about in the states, and we will adopt the Bill of Rights as soon as we can practically get to it. And they did in 1791. And so that was a big selling point for the Federalists to have to advocate to the Anti-Federalists to bring some of them that were kind of close to being on the fence to say, we need you to vote for it. We're going to put a Bill of Rights in later. And they did, in fact. So the first 10 came as a package. So how many other amendments have we had to the Constitution? Not that many. Another, let's do my math, another 17. And some of them are over, raises of Congress while they're in session. They're kind of obscure. One is to fix the Electoral College. I'll get to them when I get to them. I'm sorry. I just had too much coffee today. But the amendments to the Constitution, the first one we're going to spend is the First Amendment, which contains 5 essential freedoms that most people think are the most critical to a democratic society and to a free society. We know there's freedom of religion, and that's not all. There's kind of like it's almost broken down into 2 sections. One of them is freedom of thought when it comes to religion. Then there's actions, which the government might regulate if they have met a very compelling high burden to show the justification for the need to regulate that area of action. But beliefs are entirely protected. So one is freedom of religion. The next one is called the Establishment Clause. Some people have interpreted, in some cases have actually come down to call it what we think of as separation of church and state, that the government won't do anything to promote one religion or harm or hamper one religion over any other, nor will it basically discriminate against those that have no religious faith. So that's called the Establishment Clause, sometimes called the separation of church and state. So that's the second protection found in the First Amendment. The next one is freedom of speech. And many people think that's the most critical one, because with freedom of speech, we develop a robust democracy that different ideas and philosophies can be exchanged, hopefully civilly without violence, in order for us to move forward as a society in the right direction through this free exchange of ideas, no matter how repugnant or offensive or off the wall they might be. All of them should be protected, at least in terms of content. but we know all speech isn't necessarily protected. I'll get to that in a minute. So now we have the third protection that's found in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. The next one is freedom of assembly. A lot of people think that's already encapsulated with freedom of speech, but the framers were concerned that government might be able to curtail our ability to congregate together with like-minded, or even people aren't like-minded, in order to promote different interests that we might have as a society. So the freedom of assembly to basically unite with other groups and peoples to advocate our position needs to be protected, and that's in the First Amendment. But it doesn't get talked about sometimes as many other aspects of the First Amendment. There is some famous cases that came down in the civil rights movement, but I think it's inherently certainly related to freedom of speech, and that's the right of assembly. And the fifth one that I would make an argument that goes hand in hand with freedom of speech, and sometimes it's often interchangeably used, is the freedom of the press. We want, and don't forget, the press back then meant the printed word, and that's changed dramatically. It's in every way in which we communicate about, especially about government and societal concerns. We don't want government putting a chilling effect on that, because that kind of transparency, the ability of the press to report on the goings on, if you will, in the country, are sacrosanct. They need to be protected. And most of us agree that's what keeps us free. And that's what keeps a bit of transparency about what government is doing or not doing. And it allows, in a healthy democracy, for us to react, to put new politicians in, to remove bad ones, and to maybe put pressure on the government to change public policy in a certain area. So those are the 5 freedoms. I'm going to break this video down a little bit because I could talk for 4 or 5 hours. I could talk for an entire semester on the First Amendment. In fact, if this were a university and I was involved in a legal studies program or history, political science program at a university, I would propose a class just on the First Amendment, because there's just so much there and there's so many permeations. This is an introductory class on the history of the Constitution, so we have to talk about the fundamentals and not get too into the thicket, so to speak. So let's start off with this first video just being on the freedom of religious exercise and the Establishment Clause, and then I'll put up another video with regard to the other 3 tenets that are found in the First Amendment. Some people think there's an absolute right to do anything you want with your religious beliefs. Well, with your beliefs, that's true. The Supreme Court has often said that when it comes to philosophies and ideas and beliefs, the government has no ability or right to regulate that in any way, shape, or form. That's probably the closest we come to an absolute right under religion, is the thought. And the distinction is going to be in action. So there's religious thought, but then there's religious action. And the government generally can't even interfere with action unless they can show what? This goes to test. A compelling, we call it state interest. It should be government interest, because that throws people off thinking the federal government doesn't have a role. In fact, the First Amendment, all of the amendments for a long time, only applied to the federal government. I have to put that on the final exam. It's a very critical aspect. This is the history of the Constitution, because when the framers were creating the Bill of Rights, it was about limiting what? Centralized authority to interfere with these principles. Most people felt they were protected by their state constitutions, and therefore they didn't have to worry about that. So it starts off with, Congress shall pass no law, basically interfering with your religious rights. However, for a long time, states did. In fact, states often mandated that certain religious faiths might not even be eligible to participate in civic life, or that in many of the colonies, much of the taxes that were raised went to the Congregational Church. In the South, it was the Anglican Church, and up here in the Northeast, it was the Puritan or the Congregational Church. Actually, mandated that you be a member of the church, and if you weren't a member of the church, you might have to even leave the community, or if you were a Quaker in Massachusetts, you were executed. We have a long history of religious involvement in political life, but there was a recognition at the time the Constitution was developed that we needed to protect religious differences, and the government should have no role in sponsoring them. That's the 2 different clauses. But so I'm free to think whatever I want about religion. I can come up with the most, what you might think of as bizarre religious beliefs. That's protected. The federal government, and later through the process of incorporation, states cannot interfere. Local governments, states, federal, no government entity can interfere with my religious belief system. Generally, it still takes state action, though. So we'll get to that in a little bit of a later chapter about what state action means. But for now, thought's completely protected. But can they get involved in preventing me from certain actions? Yes. So, for example, what if my religion, in order for me to practice it faithfully, I need to sacrifice some kids? That sounds terrible, right? Obviously, the government has a very compelling interest to protect other people's lives, even if the kids, in theory, are voluntarily sacrificing their lives in order to appease our God or whatever it is. The government has a very compelling interest in doing that. Other cases like that relate to polygamy, having more than one spouse. A lot of people say, "Oh no, I don't watch cable TV, so I don't know." But every so often, I have a friend who's not a lawyer, or I should say a lawyer, but not educated in the area of religious freedoms, and they'll say, "Oh no, they do polygamy out in Utah in certain religious groups." And I said, "Well, if they're doing it illegally because it's banned in every state in the union. So they may think and they may be behaving as if they have more than one spouse, but you can only have one spouse legally because the Supreme Court said there is a compelling government interest in the sanctity of what we consider the traditional family. Now, another one that comes up is that, but the most famous case, and I might actually post it as part of your next assignment. I know we had an exam coming up, and I'm getting a little ahead for the previous material. There's a case called Yoder, and this was a case, I believe it's out of Pennsylvania. It used to be one of my favorite cases to talk about. There, the Amish people, I believe they were Amish. I hope I'm not picking the wrong religion because there's others that often get confused. The Mennonites and other groups out in that area wanted their kids to remove themselves from public school at a certain age, usually leaving elementary into like junior high or middle school or something like that. And in the Yoder case, they took it to the Supreme Court saying, under our religious dogma and our beliefs, we don't want our kids in the public schools or any schools, that are formally recognized by the state or federal government after the age of, I think it was 12 or 14, because it interferes with religious views, and we don't want them inculcated in social values that are inconsistent with our religious beliefs. The state tried to argue, or the government tried to argue, we have a compelling state interest to educate children. Otherwise, we'll have an incompetent society. But you know what the Amish were so successful doing is they're wrong, because we can prove the Amish are what? We are very self-sufficient people. We are very few of us are any kind of dole or welfare beneficiaries in any way, shape, or form, and we thrive in our communities. And so, therefore, the argument that the state has a compelling interest to educate our children falls flat. It's a failing argument. It's a non sequitur. It doesn't work. And that's what the Supreme Court, I believe, it was a unanimous decision. And therefore, the government failed to meet that burden. And that's the burden you want to remember. When the government tries to interfere with religious activities, they can only do so if they can meet that heavy burden of showing a compelling need to do so. They did it with peyote in the Native American groups. I think it's a mushroom. It's a type of drug that naturally occurs in the environment, and they were using it in certain religious practices, and they said this has been a long history of religious practice. And the federal government says, but if the government has a criminal law that deals with the question, by the very nature of the fact that the government adopted a criminal statute related, it shows they have a compelling reason. And this Native American group lost. And they said the government basically does have a compelling reason to regulate peyote, even among adults, in a religious ceremony that existed for maybe thousands of years. That got undone by the Congress actually created a federal law allowing exceptions to things like the peyote use and possession for religious practices. So it kind of did a backdoor around the Supreme Court. But if something's in the criminal statute, you can't get away with trying to argue as part of my religious practices, because the government will say, by the very nature of the legislature adopting a criminal law involved in it, you don't have that ability to exercise in that region. Religion education, I did Yoder. And that's went backwards. I got the exercise clause or the establishment clause first. Yeah, freedom to believe is always protected. Freedom to act may have some limitations on it. We know saluting the flag, for example, the government can't require us to salute the flag. Certain religious faiths find that's idolatry, worshiping a symbol that's outside of religious recognition, and the government can't force us to do that. And I like this picture here because it's one of the things I teach in my other history class, that we used to actually salute the American flag with a symbol that wasn't that much different than the Heil Hitler symbol. And of course, we did away with it right at the advent of World War II. So you can't be forced to do it, and nor can you be forced to do prayer or anything like that, because that's inconsistent both with the established, but it's also inconsistent with the freedom of religion. To be forced to do something inconsistent with your religious value, they overlap on some degree. Yeah, Yoder's a 1972 case ruled that the Amish did not have to comply with compulsory school attendance beyond the 8th grade because there's no compelling interest. They couldn't prove that these students need the education for society. And again, when a criminal law is at issue, this is another case in Employment Division versus Smith, the government did not have to prove a compelling interest, just that the law wasn't specifically targeting one religious group over another. So every so often, if I teach this class live in a Trinity class, I say, so can I bring a goat or a lamb up to the altar of my faith and slaughter it? And a lot of people say, oh, no, you can't. This is disgusting. It's gross. It's animal cruelty. But because those religious practices have long predated our nation's establishment, and as long as it's not done in some kind of cruel or bizarre, way, the government's going to have a hard time actually shutting that down. So animal sacrifices have historically been protected. Not to turn anybody off or throw anybody off, but it surprises people how much protection there is under religious freedom. Again, thought always protected, actions may not be. And you kind of, it's always about getting into the point of when does it become hurtful to individuals or society to allow that religious practice to occur, and then we'll have the test. A lot of people think our country was born or hatched out of religious freedom. No, it was actually hatched in some ways out of religious persecution. People that came over here from England, the Puritans were being persecuted in England. They came over here, but they weren't afraid. They set it up their own society, but they didn't want to have, pluralism and allow other religions. Those Puritans actually executed Quakers. So we had a large degree of religious intolerance and religious formality that was required of people to participate in society for a long time. And that brings up the second element of the religion aspect of the First Amendment, and that's the Establishment Clause. People want to think there's a very thick barrier, what we call the separation of church and state, like an impermeable wall. That's not entirely true. I'd like to think of it more as a chain link fence, where it separates the core aspect of the government being able to promote religion, religious dogma, favoring one religion over another. In a very general sense, that's true. But because of our historical and cultural overlapping events, certain things of a religious nature have been deemed to be not a violation of the Establishment Clause. Probably the one that's most controversial is the voucher. I think it's the most controversial, the voucher program. So the voucher program, the federal government and some state governments were allowing people to take what would be considered their tax contribution that went to the public schools. You can pull your kid out, you can put them in a religious school, and that's not deemed to be a violation of the Establishment Clause. If I were in the Supreme Court, I'd say, well, wait a minute. By giving the money to these religious organizations to educate children, the goal is secular. We want good education. We want parents to be able to educate their children. But there is obviously an overlap, because when you give religious organizations money, they can shift their resources in order to proselytize and promote their religious beliefs. And in a religious school, many of the requirements are to actually be educated on the religious dogma of that faith. So it's a fine line, and that was a controversial decision. It's not a uniform decision, but the courts have determined that that does not violate the Establishment Clause of the United States Constitution. But prayer in a public school, when I was a kid, we actually used to say traditional Christian prayer. I don't know if it was the Our Father or Hail Mary or something in the morning when I was very little. I remember later on that was deemed to be unconstitutional because it's obviously a Christian prayer, and that discriminates against those that are non-Christians or non-believers. So they converted it to a moment of silence. And I always had a teacher, never forgot this guy. I don't want to say his name, like it's dead, but he would say moment of silence, and he'd always say, and those of you that want to pray during the moment of silence, I urge you to do so. And I wonder if he was getting close to crossing that line, because the moment of silence may also have a secular purpose, like just kind of gathering your wits about you before your day begins in homeroom, if you will, and things like that. But to say a prayer in a public school is probably going to be barred. And there's a lot of case law on that, where at events where students would say, well, we're doing it voluntarily before the football game, a student would like to say a prayer for those that would like to hear it. The problem is it's a public institution and a prayer is being done, and it's done by the kids. If it's outside of kids in the adult form, it's actually been deemed to be a constitutional, appropriate, historical, contextual, cultural sort of phenomenon that is protected under the Constitution to be actually engaged in. And so that's why when every so often someone says, hey, I was watching the first day that Congress opened up, or I went down to DC to see the opening day, and they started off with the opening prayer for the first, for that year's congressional session. Isn't that a violation of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause? It goes, no, because one, there's not youth there, so they're not impressionable. And secondly, there's been a long history that predates even the First Amendment doing a generalized prayer. But if it pushes too far, then it crosses the line. And this also comes up with things like, schools, they can't do Christmas plays or things like that. Well, they can, but they're fearful that they're going to cross the line. And when do they cross the line? Well, now when you're with kids, they're more impressionable, and therefore the religious aspect that's being seemingly promoted has to be removed. But I don't think it would violate the Constitution to have a tree on display called a Christmas tree, as long as it also accompanies other non-religious symbols of the season, like Santa Claus and Christmas, things like that. And other religions were equally allowed to display their symbols of their faith. And this is where it kind of gets a little bit interesting, but also silly. Sometimes people are surprised that on a public piece of property, the creche or the nativity scene will be allowed to be erected. People say, well, that's unconstitutional. It's not unconstitutional because it's part of the public realm, and people should be able to freely exercise their religious faith. They're part of the public too, Christians, right? So they should be, but you can't deny Jewish people to put up a menorah, or I don't know all the other religious faiths and what they do, to put up their symbols of their faith as well. Long as you don't discriminate, it doesn't necessarily violate the Establishment Clause. It's not always easy on these cases. There are things like crucifixes on national land to memorialize deaths from World War II, and they've been there for, well, it's not 100 years, but, been 70 years. And there's a question whether or not, because it's only a Christian symbol, does that violate the Establishment Clause? And these debates go on and on. Things like having on our currency, "In God We Trust." I was a coin collector, but I guess I still am. I don't have any money, so I don't collect coins. But it says, "In God We Trust." Well, isn't that a violation of the Establishment Clause? Well, it's been historically there, and it's a generalized term, and it doesn't require me to believe in it to use the domination of exchange. So that's been held as constitutional. Same with I think the college not that long ago was doing a thing about changing the Pledge of Allegiance because it mentions God in it, things of that nature. Those are considered culturally, historically relevant, and it's not requiring indoctrination, and people don't have to participate in those events. But my argument there on the other side, if I was trying to challenge it, is those that don't want to participate often feel ostracized when they have to leave the room, or feel compelled to leave the room because they don't want to participate in that symbolic ritual. I'm a bit more, I see the practicality of what the court is with the whole Establishment Clause issue. Again, it's not a concrete wall that's totally impermeable. We allow certain religious overlapping qualities. I remember not too far, well, it was a couple of years after 9/11, I was working at the Mount, one of my, maybe it was 2006 or 2007, and there was a bit of a backlash against certain racial and ethnic groups in our country because of 9/11. It was really sad. And so we always have a prayer at convocation, at the graduation. And it's usually given by this Unitarian minister, and she gives a very generalized sort of prayer and she kind of makes it broad to all kinds of different faiths. But this one year they wanted to bring in some kind of, I guess, diversity inclusion. I kid you not. And I was sitting next to a former nun who was an instructor at the Mount back in the time. She just recently passed away, a wonderful lady, a good friend of mine. And she's a former nun, still Catholic, but she left the nunhood to become a professor at the Mount Wachusett Community College. And they literally had a priest, a pastor, a Muslim cleric, a rabbi, and again, the Unitarian Church member. And it must have been a half hour of short little religious prayers. And the person next to me goes, Corman, this has to be violating the separation of church and state. And it probably was. It went pretty far. I felt like I was at a religious sort of smorgasbord of prayers, and we were a state institution, so it's problematic. We're a private institution, totally allowable. And that's the big distinction you have to remember about this concept is it state action versus private entities. Private entities can, if I had a private company, and I could do all kinds of symbolic religious, I could have the 10 Commandments behind me in my law office if I so wanted, if it was a private law office. But at the Mount, if I had that, I might be violating church and state, because non-Christian students might be very uncomfortable if I had the 10 Commandments embodied on a poster behind me. Now, here's one thing that interesting that confuses people. Now, and this happened at the Mount, there was a club at the Mount. I don't know what they were called, but they a Christian group, and they would meet like, I don't know, it was weekly or monthly, like most clubs. And it was a Christian group. And somebody says, well, doesn't it violate the establishment of church? No, because if you don't allow clubs, as long as it's not sponsored by the college, there's an art club, there's a legal studies club at one time, there's I think there was a foreign language club or a music club. There's clubs of all kinds of sort. There was a gaming club. Why, if you don't allow a religious group to come in and have open, free space, just like other community groups, you're discriminating against. You're actually violating their free exercise under the Constitution. As long as what? The college itself wasn't sponsoring, requiring, or promoting the concept. And it's a fine line. Those of you that want to do it, and probably should, you should read the Lemon case. In the Lemon case, and it's an unfortunate term because people think it has something to do with lemons, that was actually one of the petitioner's names. The court came up with a very difficult formula to determine when the government crosses the line on the Establishment Clause. And the first element is whether or not the government has a secular purpose, meaning a non-religious purpose for doing what they're doing, like educating kids with the voucher program. Secondly, how far is there any other means by which the government could have met those ends without basically becoming entangled in the religious faith? The next one is, how entangled is the government in promoting, in adopting, or proselytizing the position of that faith? Not an easy test to apply. All of the elements of the rule kinds of overlap with each other. And like some justices say, you kind of know it when you see it when the government has gone too far with regard to engaging with religion faiths. No matter how salutary the outcome goal, other faiths will be discriminated against as a result of that participation with that specific faith or groups of faiths. It's a fun topic for those of you that are interested in this kind of stuff. Yeah, voucher program was constitutional. And I like this one about school prayer. It says, in this country, it is in no part of the business of government to compose official prayers for any group of American people to recite a part of a religious program carried on by the government. And that's the definition from this case of Engel versus Vitale in 1962. And that's kind of summarizes the same sentiment to this day about regarding school prayer. Court has prohibited public schools from sponsoring religious activity. Doesn't mean religious activity can't go on at the school as long as it's not sponsored, promoted, advocated by government. And it's different between school children and adults. We know there's less of a concern about violating the Establishment Clause. And again, how much does the action of the government promote a secular, non-religious purpose for why they're doing what they're doing? Let's see, am I missing anything in there? Oh, saluting the flag, we know about this. And again, the compelling state interest, groups. And then we're going to pick up, and this is 30 minutes. 30 minutes probably too long for most of you anyways, but all we talked about is free exercise, and the Establishment Clause in a very broad way. The book does a fantastic job. I might post some other material or articles or cases that I want you to read with regard to this for the next assignment, but I'll put up another video, if not today, tomorrow, on a very more challenging topic, which is freedom of speech, and it's not absolute. Be well.